Basically everything that we talk about are questions. I mean, that's the entire purpose of when we get together, right?
True.
And so the interesting thing is I don't hear a lot of stuff at times in the church being talked about questions in general. You know, there are times where they're talked about, but not really a whole lot. And there are a lot of issues that come up in Bible classes, I think, with questions. I love to preach because no one gets to talk but me. And that sounds so conceited, but what I mean by that is I don't have to worry about someone coming out of left field with something that has nothing to do with what I'm talking about. And that people mean well. I'm not saying they don't, but a lot of times I've been in classes before, and I've got a good friend of mine who will apologize before he's about to ask something. And I know it means it's not going to be anything to do with what we're talking about. And so, we've got questions about questions, but I think sometimes we've got problems with people trying to trip up a teacher they don't like. And this can happen with preachers too, because typically speaking, the preachers also teach the class on Sunday mornings and Wednesday night. Yeah. And there might be a member who the preacher has preached on a sermon and he's not really appreciative of the approach the preacher took or the stance that he took. And so he says, you know what? I'm going to show him in the only way I know how, and I'm going to try to ensnare him and trip him up in class. So what would you do if someone is trying to entrap a teacher with their questions?
An interesting thing, when I first began to preach, and one of the elders that was there, he was a mentor to me. He's the one that baptized me into Christ. Right. He helped me in first learning how to preach and how to teach class. And one of the things that I remember that he did, it kind of drove some of the other members kind of crazy, and I'll explain that in a minute, but he would ask me questions that he knew that maybe I was not quite ready for. I was a very green, I'd not even been off to school or anything, so I'm just learning on the fly. And we had been studying, and so sometimes we would talk about things, but he would talk about, or he would bring up in class a particular thing, and somebody after class would go, does he not like you? What's wrong? So they thought it was a certain thing. I knew that he was trying to help me. He would ask a question maybe I didn't necessarily know how to answer, but he would help me answer it in the class. And he said, I'll never take you down a road that I can't bring you back, but right. That kind of thing, But I know that other people perceive that to be he was being mean-spirited, or maybe he was trying to trap me in some way. And so I know that people can do that. Mm-hmm. That was a great learning tool for me, and it truly helped me. And I always had to kind of go to his defense. No, he loves me. He's a father to me, in that way, and he's helped me a lot. But at the same time, I've also been teaching where people have. I've been the brunt of their entrapment. Mm-hmm. Tried to say something to trip me up in some way, or to get me to change what I was teaching, or say something off, or right. something like that. Maybe the way that they ask the question. But usually you can tell when that's coming, and certainly we need to be mindful of that. And how do we handle that would probably be another good question on that. And I would say that when you have that taking place in class, number one, you have to remember you're still leading that class.
Right.
And you don't have to answer every question that's asked in a class. And especially when it's off topic, when it's off kilter, when the motive of asking the question is not at all pure, but you can tell that they're trying to trap you. I think of Jesus, the Jewish leaders trying to entrap him, trying to catch him in something that they could use against him. And so that's the idea, and so again, you don't have to answer every question, but if you do, answer it in a way so that you can put a stop to that kind of practice, right. Because you're leading the class. You right. are the leader in that class. That's why you're there. Yeah. And so we have to be mindful of that as well. And I would say also, you still want to do so you don't want to be rude. Right. You don't want to go down the same road that they're going down. But you want to obviously set the stage to try to put an end to some of that foolishness in a class.
Right. One thing I've started saying in classes is, and I do it when I get off track too, and it's kind of a subtle way that I think people have realized, and it helps because it's a nice, lighthearted way to say it, but I'll say, well, there's the rabbit. I've killed him. Now let's move on. And so it just kind of lets people know we kind of got off track. We went rabbit hunting, but the rabbit's dead now, and we can get back to what we were talking about. And I've also at times said to some of the members when a question like that's asked from a good-hearted nature, they ask a question, and we're not talking about that. And I remember one day I came there and I was studying about something, and it had nothing to do with Revelation. But there were questions about Revelation being asked. And I finally said, well, I came here today to talk about this, and we're really not talking about that. And so I'm not opposed to studying that at another time, but I have not studied that recently to where I could confidently give you an answer.
Yeah.
And like you said, it would be a good question to say, well, how do we handle that? One of the easiest ways to handle it is, you know what, let me study on that and get back to you.
Absolutely.
And you kind of put it back to that individual that says, hey, you didn't really get me, because I'm going to be the bigger man and be more humble enough to say, I don't know enough to answer that. And that's the thing, is we have to have that humility, because when I first started preaching, I had this idea that I had to answer every question. And my coworker finally sat me down one day and says, you don't have to answer everything when it's asked. You can say, let me study on it further, because what I was doing was I was answering things, and sure, I was giving the right answer, but I wasn't giving the proof that it was the right answer.
Yeah.
And so I finally got to a point now where it's just, you know what, I'm not quite sure. It's been a while. Let me kind of freshen up on it, and we can come back and I'll give you an answer next week. But you have to remember to come back next week and give the answer.
Yeah.
Otherwise, people are going to say, yeah, when he says that, what he means is, I'm never going to get to that. So you just kind of forget it for a while.
Yeah.
But you mentioned that the Jewish leaders tried to entangle Jesus, and that's exactly what Matthew 22:15 says, that the Pharisees went and plotted how they might entangle him in his talk.
Yeah.
How can we trip Jesus up? And so they go to before Jesus, then they send their disciples with the Herodians saying, teacher, we know that you're true, and you teach the way of God in truth, and you don't care about anyone, for you don't regard the person of men. So tell us, what do you think? Should we pay taxes or not? And Jesus is there, and in their mind, they're thinking, we'll get him.
Yeah.
We got him. And Jesus simply looks at them and says, why are you testing me, you hypocrites? I think that's an answer that I couldn't necessarily give in a Bible class.
Probably
but
not.
Jesus is able to sit there and say, what are you testing me for, you hypocrite?
Yeah.
Whose inscription's on it? Who's who's on there? Oh, well, that's Caesar's. Okay, well, then you give to Caesar what's Caesar's, and you give to God what's God's.
Yeah.
And what he did there is he answered it in the way that they thought he would answer it, but in a way that wasn't controversial. He was saying, well, if it's Caesar's, you give it to Caesar. But ultimately, that money is not just Caesar's. Yeah. It's also God's. And so he says, you give to Caesar what's Caesar's, you give to God what's God's. And when they heard the words, they marveled at what he said, because they're like, man, we didn't actually get to entrap him like we thought we could.
Right.
And we have people today that they will do everything they can to try to ensnare people with the way that they talk. And they want to videotape it. Recently, I was out at a door knocking, and there were these people who were preaching on the street, and they were videotaping it. And so I was asking one of the people that was with that group some questions. I said, well, ask the preacher. I said, no, you guys are videotaping it, and I'm just not going to get on video asking. I'd love to have a private study with y'all, but I know how that works. I know you can take things and twist it around and make it sound like I said something I didn't say. And so, you kind of avoid those times where you could be entrapped. But in a Bible class, you don't have that luxury.
Right.
And so you kind of have to sit there and say, okay, the best way to do this is to do unto others as we would have it done to us. And so if I sit in a class and someone is teaching, and we've had this experience too probably in our ministry, where someone's teaching and it's like, I don't know if I'd take that approach. Well, how do I treat them? Do I try to entrap them with questions and try to trip them up? Or do I simply ask questions in a way that maybe would spark questions and discussion, but wouldn't be well, I showed him. I really got him, and that he'll never do that again. And that's just it. You're not going to be able to get people to trip up. And if you do, what have you really said about yourself?
Yeah.
That, I got the preacher on a subject he hasn't been studying. Man, I really showed him. Well, then the preacher, if he's worth his salt, is going to study on that subject. Right. And come back and say, by the way, here's a more concise answer to what I was saying last week.
Yeah, and I would add to that as well. You made the statement. Well, I don't know. I'd like to freshen up. On that and study that a little bit and come back to that. And I would add the closed part of that question. And you wouldn't mind if we waited until then, would you?
Right.
And so that does put it back on them, and they have to okay, well, that'll be okay. But what you've done is you've put them back at bay,
right.
so to speak,
right.
and caused them, they know that you know exactly what they're trying to do.
Right.
And probably other people have picked up on it as well. But there's nothing wrong with saying, I don't know, and I'll study and I'll come back. There's nothing wrong with that. Sometimes we think when we're teaching class, we have to know all the things.
Right.
And we just don't.
Right.
That's not the case. That's so we have to be mindful of that. But yes, people can try to trip us up and do that, but we can put a stop to that in a class.
Yeah, and we don't even know all the answers to the class that we've been studying a lot of.
Sure.
I mean, we're studying grace at this moment at Somerville, and someone could easily ask me a question about grace, and I could go, you know what, I'm not 100% sure. Let me go back and check that a little bit. Let me be a fact checker, as we've talked about before, and let me make sure before I tell you something that it's accurate.
Right.
Because more damage is done by saying what you don't know than saying I don't know.
Absolutely.
And that's the thing that we have to remember. And so, should we try to entrap teachers in our questions? No. I mean, the fact of the matter is people who do this wouldn't want it done to them.
Right.
And that's the hard part is no matter what happens, the preacher or the Bible class teacher still has to be a Christian, even if someone has mistreated him. Because if the preacher is put on the spot and then the next quarter that person's teaching, the preacher can't sit there and go, now's my chance.
Right.
I finally get an opportunity to get this guy back. No, we still have to be Christ-like. Yeah. And that's the thing. Entrap people? No, that's not Christ-like. But then there's this other part of Bible classes that happens a lot with debates. A lot of Bible classes turn into debates at times, it seems. And if a controversial subject is being taught, and let's say, for instance, there have been congregations that have been teetering towards a certain aspect of liberalism or a certain aspect of unfaithfulness to God. They haven't preached the whole counsel, and maybe an eldership says, you know what, we want to correct that. So we're going to hire someone that we know will preach the truth. We're going to bring him in, and he gets out, and he's spent the time getting up the relationship with the congregation. He doesn't come in preaching hellfire and brimstone, but he finally says, okay, I've been here a couple years. It's time to talk about some subjects that are difficult to hear.
Right.
And he gets into a Bible class setting. He starts talking about it, and all of a sudden he's met with a bunch of debates and questions that are intended to start debates.
Yeah.
Well, I know you said this is the case. And for instance, a really good example of this is with baptism. Well, what about the thief on the cross? You're automatically trying to incite a debate of, do you really think the thief on the cross was saved? Well, he wasn't baptized. And the question is asked in such a way as, let me get you to debate me on this, because I think I'm right and I think you're wrong. So what would you do if someone is asking a question that seems to be starting a public debate in class?
There again, if I'm teaching, or even if I'm just in the class and sitting there, sometimes as the preacher, I'm not always teaching class, which is kind of nice little break.
Right.
And I've seen that come up where someone is either entrapped, trying to be entrapped, or a debate started up, and I'm going to help the very best that I can to kind of bail the teacher out if they seemingly need it. Now, they may handle the situation and be fine. I may not have to say a word to do it, but I'm also going to show my support and back them up, maybe with a couple of statements, whatever I can do to help kind of pacify, if you will, that debative attitude.
Right.
The public class, Bible class setting is rarely the best place for a debate. Now, it's good for discussion, and it's good for the teacher who has studied the material, who knows the material best, to present the material and ask questions that will engage us in learning and drawing us into how that material was attained and how they were, how we can understand that best. And then the application comes a little bit later. And that's where a lot of discussion obviously comes in, is in the application phase of a class. But the public Bible class is not the best place for a debate. There may come a time when, we have to stand for the truth. Something is absolutely blatant, and you can see that there's a push for a certain thing, and so something has to be said. And there's times for that, but most of the time, we can ask for clarification. We can and I think that's okay.
Right.
Now if I am teaching class and someone wants to debate, wants to throw up things like that, there again, I'm going to probably mostly stick to kind of what I've put together, because that's the logical way that, number one, I've understood it and have planned to present it. And there again, if somebody brings up, if I'm doing class on baptism and I'm just introducing the material to begin with, and we're not there where we can talk about some of the other questions that might come up. Well, what about the thief on the cross? Or what about this? Or what about that? And somebody wants to bring that up. Well, sometimes what happens, you're teaching class, and I've had this happen, I don't know how many times. Always have somebody, that you're in your introductory statements, and there's a hand that comes up.
Yeah.
You're like, I'm not there yet, man. Give me a minute.
Right,
let me present some material, and then we'll get into it.
Well, and truth of the matter is, 9 times out of 10, if people would let us finish, we're probably going to answer the question they're going to ask.
Sure.
We probably have already thought that through, because that's our job, is to sit there and say, okay, I'm going to preach on salvation. What is every question that could possibly ask on salvation, and make sure I have some type of understanding on it. And so, it's like you said, let me get through just a little bit here, and you might even have your question answered.
Right. But let me be able to present it in a logical way.
Right.
So that we get 1 + 1 + 1, and now we can add it all up and see what it equals, when we're going through, that particular study. And so there again, it's a matter of kind of setting the stage. And, we don't always have the luxury. If you go visit somewhere, you don't have the luxury to know always how a class is conducted and who the troublemaker is in the class. There's always seems to be a troublemaker somewhere in there. Hopefully that's not the case. Maybe it's not in most places, but occasionally that's the case, where you have somebody that kind of wants to stir the pot.
Right.
And just so that either that they're heard in a class setting, they get some kind of say, or they put the preacher on the spot, and they think, well, we're going to test his mettle, and we're going to see if he's got what it takes, in that way. And all of those are not pure motives.
Right.
Legitimate questions I'm okay with.
Yeah. Questions
that are off-putting in that way, then we need to, actually, I'm going to answer that question, later in my material. If you won't mind waiting until we get there, would you?
Right.
And so kind of putting it there again back on them, because they've jumped the gun. Here's a premature question, essentially. And maybe it wasn't just to debate. Maybe it was just a little premature.
Right.
And so we can handle questions like that. I'm okay with questions. There are ways to deal with those in class and to kind of get through that. And I think when the teacher knows that and understands that, they're a little bit more at ease going in saying, okay, number one, I don't have to answer every question. Right. And if it's a debative question, I can put that off. There's a way to handle that. If it's premature, I can put that off until later. If it's a out left field type of question, there's a way to handle that as well.
Right. Well, you think about it, most congregations do what we'd call a quarter system for classes. Mm-hmm. Some don't, but most of them would. And so we're about to start a 13-week study on grace, and someone raised their hand. Well, we want you to answer this aspect of grace. That's week 10. Could you write it down, and I'll make sure to get to it. But that's just it. It's like if you start studying the book of Colossians, and someone says, "Well, preacher, what do you think about chapter 3, verse 2?" Well, we're introducing the book today. Give me a moment to. Like you said,
talked about the author yet.
Right, we're not even sure, how the introduction is going to go just yet. And let me get through this, like you said, in a logical way. And I think the times where we see the debate start is primarily, what I've seen at least, is with salvation. Because and salvation, marriage, divorce, and remarriage, those are two of the biggest debated topics, because everybody has a scenario of a what if. And I know we always ask, what would you do if? But in truth, I can what would you do if you till you die, and just continue to one up what your question is. And that's what tends to happen with debates is, but what if they're seeking the truth but they die before they become a Christian? What if this person is married but you didn't know about this part of it? And it's like, okay, well, we can do that. Right. And we can get into a debate about it, or I can tell you what the scriptures say, and you can let that kind of to be what the final word is.
Right.
And a lot of times I think what needs to be understood too is, We have people who are visiting at times, and they're sitting in these classes. They want to find a church home, and the way that we treat each other is going to dictate whether they do that or not. And so if they come into a class and they see that, John Smith over here is always arguing with the preacher, they're going to probably sit there and go, I don't know if I want to be here. Right. Maybe I don't want to do this. And that's the thing. Isaiah 1:18 tells us to reason together, not to debate each other, but to come and to reason together. And so will we always agree on everything? Absolutely not. But do we have to make everything a public showing and debate? No. And I think that's also our issue. We talked about social media recently. Man, everything turns into a debate, it seems, on social media.
Sure.
And people will debate about things that they don't even have a dog in the fight. Like, when the sporting world, I see this a lot. I'm reading an article about the Steelers, my favorite team, and then in the comments it says, Ravens fan here, the Steelers are horrible. I'm like, we don't want you on our article. I mean, you have no business being here. You've just come to stir up trouble.
Right.
And you're just wanting to debate about something, then the article had nothing to do with your team.
Yeah.
And, stay out of it. And a lot of times with Bible class situations, too, it's, can we reason together and just talk about things and not make everything a public spectacle and a public debate? Because the way that we are reported about matters.
Yeah.
The way that people perceive us and see us matters. And we forget that. And sometimes it's like I mentioned at the very beginning of what we were talking about, well, the preacher offended me because of what he said. I'm going to get him back.
Right.
And what they don't realize is, you might get the preacher, but you also might get the members. A situation that happened to me a long time ago was I was publicly called out in a Bible class by an individual. And I mean torn down. And this brother repented, and there's no ill will anymore toward this, but the situation happened. And what he thought was going to happen in the moment was that I was going to look worse. And what I had to do was maintain composure, be a Christian. But people came up to me afterwards and hugged my neck. And so what really had happened was not what he thought was going to happen.
Sure.
It was the opposite. And that's just it. If we maintain our composure as teachers, whether we're preachers or just regular Bible class teachers, we can still come out on the other end of that having done the best part and having looked more Christ-like. Right. And it's not a competition of, well, let me see how I can come out on top in this, but it's, how would Jesus handle this? How would we need to handle it? And so starting a public debate in Bible class is not the time.
Right.
You can, and that's the thing. You got a question for the Bible class teacher. You know what's amazing about Bible class is it's over and he doesn't just disappear. He's still there, and you can go up to him privately and talk to him about some of these matters. And 9 times out of 10, that will be more well received and a lot easier to talk about in a private setting, because what happens sometimes is if someone presents it in a certain way, 6 or 7 people will gang up on you.
Right.
And now you're having a debate with not just one person where you can kind of talk about it, but he's saying something. Well, that sparks this sister's thoughts, and so she's going to say something. And now this brother's thought. And all of a sudden it's, man, now I've got to answer these 12 questions before I can even get back to the original discussion. And so starting a public debate, that's not the time or place to do it.
And sometimes it turns into a debate among those brethren, and you're just playing, you're in the middle.
Yeah, you're the moderator.
You're moderating.
And, we can't have that.
Right.
But I think another thing that happens in the question world a lot is asking questions we can't possibly know the answer to. Now, we can do that, but what would you do if someone's asking you questions we can't know the answer to? And a chief example would be John 8. What did Jesus write on the ground? Tell us, preacher, what did he write? Yeah. What would you do if that happened to you in a class?
Well, certainly, it always gets brought up. I just taught John 8, just a few weeks ago, in fact, and the question is, I wonder, what did he write? Right. We always do when we come across that. There are questions, and we call them curiosity questions. We don't really know the answer, and they really have no bearing whatsoever on salvation or really necessarily our spiritual growth. When we talk about they're just curiosity, in that way. And what we have to be reminded of as teachers there again, I don't want to focus on the curiosity part of it where I can't really know the answer anyway. Right. And so you got to bring it back. You're in charge of that class, you're leading that class, and so you say, well, that's an interesting thought, isn't it? What did Jesus write? Twice he stooped down and wrote on the ground. I wonder what he was writing. What did he finish the second time he was writing? Was he drawing a picture? Was he drawing stick figures of the guys that walked in? Well, there's any number of things that it could have been. Does any of it really matter? No, it doesn't. And so, it's okay to have that question asked or to bring it up yourself. What I usually do is go ahead and bring it up myself in the class. Say, hey, we'd all love to know what he wrote, but we don't. And that part of it's not the point of why John's recorded it.
Right.
Now, it is an interesting fact that John wrote it. And it does speak, it's kind of an inspiration mark, these little details that John gave in his record, they're little inspiration marks. They kind of show some detail about what actually happened. And whether it's a time feature or whether it's, him kneeling down and writing on the ground, those kind of things. How did he respond?
Right.
That's, why did he respond that way? Now that's a good question. Well, they were trying to trap him again, and they thought if he answered this way or if he answered this way, we got him either way, either under Jewish law or Roman law, we're going to nail this guy this time, so we've got it. And so Jesus said, well, I'm just going to write down over here on the ground. I'm just going to kneel down and scribble something. Maybe they could see it, maybe they couldn't. Maybe that was the point of it all, one way or the other. But the fact that he didn't, but then they kept on.
Yeah.
And he does then stand up and say, he who is without sin cast the first stone. So the one that typically would have found the individual would have been typically the one to throw.
Right.
Who's making this all of this, bringing all this to light, would have been the first one to the accuser. Right. To throw the first stone in that way. And I think that it's interesting to me when these questions are brought up. Most of the time, in a personal Bible study, sometimes these are brought up, and they're brought up to throw off the conversation, the real conversation that we're trying to have.
Right.
And so what you want to do is get it back to, say, well, that conversation, that question, is interesting, but does it really shed light on what's most important right here? Because what's most important is this. And so let's, either you can ask questions. So don't you want to get back to our study at hand, or back to what we're talking about? Again, not running down a rabbit trail or anything like that. So.
Right, and if we're not careful, we haggle over details that don't need to be haggled over.
Right.
And we talk more about the essential details of a story, because the entire point of John 8 is not what Jesus wrote. It doesn't matter if he wrote the Greek alphabet on the ground.
Yeah.
What matters is that a woman had been caught in sin, and Jesus puts out a point that says, whoever's without sin, you cast the first stone, and no one could do that.
Yeah.
And then Jesus looks at the woman and says, your accusers don't accuse you, then neither I can accuse you. Go and sin no more. And nothing is mentioned about what was written on the ground. And we have all scriptures given by the inspiration of God, and is profitable.
Yeah.
But it's not everything that we know. The secret things belong to the Lord, Deuteronomy tells us. And so, do we need to ask questions we can't know the answer to? No. I mean, we can, and it would be not a bad thing to sometimes say, what do you think he wrote? Just to kind of discuss it.
Right.
But to have this idea of that we've got to know what we need to know, there's no point in that.
Yeah.
No point in that at all.
And not to let it take over the main point of the class, which was Jesus teaching them, about having compassion on those and not condemning her in that way.
Right.